The darkness pressed in from all sides, like a living thing. September 12, 1942, Guadalcanal. 840 Marines dug their entrenching tools into the Kenai grass and volcanic soil of a nameless ridge 1,000 yards south of Henderson Field. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to face 3,000 Japanese soldiers in a fight that would decide the fate of the entire Pacific War. Colonel Merritt Austin Edson moved along the ridgeline as his men worked. The sun had dipped below the horizon, turning the jungle canopy into an impenetrable wall of shadow. Edson's red hair and ice-blue eyes had earned him the nickname Red Mike among his raiders, but there was nothing soft about the man. At 45, he carried the experience of 2 decades in the Marine Corps, including guerrilla warfare in Nicaragua. He'd need every bit of that experience tonight. His force consisted of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and 2 companies from the 1st Parachute Battalion. Elite troops. The best America had, but even the best can bleed. Even the best can break. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am telling it, hit that like button and subscribe. These men deserve to have their story told, and your support helps make that possible. The ridge they occupied wasn't much to look at in daylight. A low grassy spine of coral and volcanic rock running roughly north-south, maybe 1,400 yards long. Hill 123 sat on the southern end, barely worthy of the name at 80 feet of elevation. But on an island where every foot of high ground mattered, this ridge was everything. It was the last natural defensive position before Henderson Field. Henderson Field. The reason anyone cared about this miserable island. The airstrip the Japanese had started building, the airstrip the Marines had captured on August 7th, when they'd stormed ashore in America's first offensive operation of the war. The airstrip that now housed F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers that could strike Japanese shipping and bases across the Solomon Islands. Control Henderson, control the Solomons. Control the Solomons, control the sea lanes to Australia. Lose Henderson, lose the Pacific. The Japanese knew it. That's why they kept coming. 4 days earlier, on September 8th, Edson's raiders had conducted a raid on the Japanese supply base at Tasimboko, 20 miles east along the coast. They'd gone in expecting a fight. What they found shocked them. Mountains of supplies, rice bags stacked higher than a man's head, ammunition crates by the hundreds, artillery pieces, medical supplies, and equipment for thousands of troops. Far more than intelligence had suggested. Edson had personally walked through the captured base, his mind working through the implications. The Japanese weren't just reinforcing, they were preparing for a major offensive. He'd loaded his men down with captured documents, maps, orders. Then he'd put the torch to everything else. The flames had climbed into the tropical sky as the raiders pulled back to their boats. Now, 4 days later, those documents had been translated. The intelligence picture was clear. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi commanded the Japanese 35th Infantry Brigade, somewhere out there in the jungle. His mission, recapture Henderson Field. His plan, march through the supposedly impenetrable jungle south of the American perimeter, emerge at the ridge, sweep north to the airfield. He'd sent word to 17th Army headquarters that he would attack at 1600 hours on September 12th. Kawaguchi had gotten one thing right. The Americans hadn't expected an attack from the south. The jungle was thick, the terrain brutal, but he'd gotten everything else catastrophically wrong. He'd underestimated American strength. He'd underestimated American resolve. And he'd underestimated the man now walking the ridgeline, checking fields of fire, positioning machine guns. Edson had convinced Division Commander Major General Alexander Vandegrift to let him move his raiders and the Paramarines to the ridge. They were supposed to be resting after the Tasimboko raid. Rest would have to wait. Edson had studied those captured documents. He knew the ridge was the target. He just didn't know when. The raiders settled into their positions as darkness completed its takeover of the island. Most of them carried M1903 Springfield rifles, the bolt-action workhorses that had seen service since before World War I. Some of the raiders had the newer M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles, but not many. The Marine Corps was still transitioning, and the infantry units headed to Guadalcanal had gotten what was available, which meant most Marines made do with 5-round clips and bolt actions, while the rear echelon units back home carried Garands. The squad leaders had Thompson submachine guns, the M1928 and M1928A1 models, with their distinctive drum or stick magazines, excellent for close-quarters work. Each squad also had a Browning automatic rifle, the M1918A2, capable of selective fire and serving as the squad's base of fire. But the real killers, the weapons that had saved Marine positions again and again since the landing, were the Browning M1918A1 heavy machine guns, water-cooled, belt-fed, firing .30-06 ammunition at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute. Set up a couple of those with overlapping fields of fire, and you could turn jungle into a killing ground. Edson's men also had mortars, the 60mm mortars at company level, light enough for a crew to manhandle through the jungle. The heavier 81mm mortars at battalion level, capable of reaching out to 3,000 yards. And behind them, supporting the perimeter, the division had artillery. The 75mm pack howitzers and the 105mm howitzers that could deliver high explosive shells with devastating effect. If the Japanese came, they'd walk into a storm of American steel. The night was never truly silent on Guadalcanal. The jungle breathed with its own sounds. Insects buzzed and clicked. Birds called from the darkness. The wind rustled through kunai grass tall enough to hide a crouching man. But there were other sounds, too, mechanical sounds, the distant rumble of ship engines out beyond the coastline. At 21:30 hours, the first shells screamed overhead. Japanese cruisers offshore opened up with their main batteries. 5- and 6-inch naval guns designed for ship-to-ship combat now turned against land targets. The shells came in like freight trains, the sound building from a whisper to a roar before the impacts. Geysers of earth and coral erupted along the ridge. Marines pressed themselves into their fighting holes, feeling the concussion through the ground, tasting dirt and cordite. The bombardment lasted 20 minutes. Not long by the standards of the Western Front in 1918, but devastating to men who had no cover beyond what they dug with their hands. When the naval guns finally went silent, the ringing in the Marines' ears continued. They shook off the dirt, checked their weapons, peered into the darkness to the south. Then the jungle came alive. The Japanese infantry emerged from the trees like ghosts. Kawaguchi's men had been marching for days through terrain that broke stronger men. They'd humped through swamps, forded rivers, cut through vegetation so thick it seemed solid. They'd been promised the Americans would flee before the might of the Emperor's soldiers. They'd been promised an easy victory. Instead, they walked into overlapping fields of fire from Marines who had no intention of going anywhere. The initial probing attacks hit the forward positions between the Lunga River and the ridge. Bursts of rifle fire cracked through the night. The heavy machine guns opened up, their muzzle flashes strobing the darkness. Tracers lanced out like lines of fire. The Japanese kept coming. When the first wave fell, another formed behind it. One of the Marine companies on the forward slope found itself surrounded. Japanese infiltrators had worked through the gaps in the line, getting behind the American positions. The company commander made the call. Pull back to the ridge. The Marines moved in good order, carrying their wounded. But the loss of that forward ground meant the Japanese were now at the base of the ridge itself. Edson was everywhere, moving from position to position, his voice cutting through the chaos. Encouraging here, redirecting fire there, calling in mortar strikes on coordinates he'd memorized during the daylight reconnaissance. He seemed to have no fear, walking upright through fire that made other men crawl. The fighting died down around midnight. The Japanese pulled back to regroup. The Marines used the lull to redistribute ammunition, treat wounded, shore up positions. Edson walked the line again, his command voice carrying in the darkness. "They'll be back. Check your ammunition. Fix your bayonets. When they come, kill them." September 13th dawned with the smoke of battle still hanging over the ridge. The kunai grass smoldered where mortar rounds had sparked fires. Japanese bodies lay in windows at the base of the ridge and scattered across the forward slopes. The Marines counted their own casualties. Too many. But they still held the ridge. During the daylight hours, Edson reorganized his defense. He'd lost ground the night before, but he'd learned the Japanese approach routes. He consolidated his forces, tightened his lines, registered his artillery and mortars on likely assembly areas. The Wildcats from Henderson Field roared overhead, searching for Japanese concentrations in the jungle. They found some, strafed and bombed, but Kawaguchi's main force remained hidden beneath the jungle canopy. The Japanese general was undeterred by the previous night's failure. His men had bloodied the Americans, pushed them back. One more attack, one more night, and Henderson Field would be his. He gathered his commanders, issued his orders. Tonight they would throw everything at the ridge. No more probing, a full assault. As the sun set on September 13th, Edson's Marines braced for what they knew was coming. The word had spread through the ranks. The Japanese were coming in force. This was the big push. Hold the ridge, save Henderson Field. Lose the ridge, lose the island. It was that simple. The naval bombardment started earlier this time, 2100 hours. The cruisers offshore pounded the ridge with everything they had. Shell after shell screamed in. The Marines hunkered down and endured. Some prayed, some cursed. All of them waited. Then the Japanese artillery joined in. They'd brought field guns forward during the day, carefully concealed from American air attacks. Now they opened fire, adding their shells to the maelstrom. The ridge became an inferno of high explosive and flying metal. At 21:30 hours, the barrage lifted. In the sudden relative quiet, the Marines could hear them coming. Thousands of men moving through the jungle, converging on the ridge. The Japanese commanders shouted orders in their own language. Officers drew their swords. NCOs leveled their rifles. The assault hit like a tsunami. Over 3,000 Japanese infantry surged forward, not in careful tactical bounds, not with fire and maneuver. They came on in a banzai charge, screaming their battle cries, bayonets fixed, determined to overwhelm the American position through sheer weight of numbers and fighting spirit. The Marines opened fire. The M19 M17A1 heavy machine guns traversed their firing arcs, the gunners holding down the triggers, feeding belt after belt through the mechanisms. The water jackets grew hot despite the cooling systems. Barrels glowed red in the darkness. But the guns kept firing, kept cutting down Japanese soldiers by the dozen. The barmen worked their weapons in short, controlled bursts. The riflemen worked their bolts, 5 rounds, reload, 5 rounds, reload. The rhythm of combat. The smoke grew so thick it became difficult to breathe, difficult to see. Men aimed at muzzle flashes, at shadows, at movement. The Japanese crashed into the Marine lines, bayonets against bayonets, rifle butts against rifle butts. Men grappled in the darkness, too close for bullets, killing each other with knives and entrenching tools and bare hands. The para-Marines on the left flank found themselves in desperate hand-to-hand combat as a Japanese thrust threatened to roll up the entire position. Edson saw the danger. He grabbed the reserve company of para-Marines, the men who'd been held back for just such a moment. "Fix bayonets. Follow me." He led them in a counterattack against the Japanese who'd penetrated the left flank. The para-Marines hit the Japanese from the side, bayonets leveled, and the shock of the impact drove the attackers back down the slope. But the Japanese kept coming, wave after wave. When one attack faltered, another surged forward to take its place. The Marines were being pushed back, step by step, fighting hole by fighting hole. The center of the line buckled. Men fell. Positions were overrun. The Japanese were on the ridge crest now, only yards from breaking through. Edson stood on the highest point still, in Marine hands, fully exposed to enemy fire, directing the defense. His voice carried over the gunfire. "The only thing the Japanese have that we don't is guts. We've got more guts than they have." He called in artillery danger close. Shells landed within 100 yards of the Marine positions, chewing up the Japanese assault formations. He called in mortar fire, walking the rounds back and forth across the ridge. The fighting reached a crescendo around midnight. Both sides were exhausted. The Marines were down to their last reserves of ammunition. The Japanese had suffered horrific casualties, but continued to press forward. This was the moment, the hinge of fate, everything balanced on the edge of a blade. Then the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines arrived. They'd been held in reserve at the main perimeter, ready to reinforce wherever needed. Now they double-timed through the darkness, these fresh Marines, and they slammed into the Japanese flank just as the enemy was preparing what they hoped would be the final assault. The shock was enormous. The Japanese, who thought they were on the verge of victory, suddenly found themselves taking fire from a new direction. The Japanese attack broke, not all at once, not in a rout. But the momentum shifted. The assault waves that had been surging forward began to waver, then stopped, then started to pull back. The Marine fire increased in intensity. Every man who still had ammunition fired it. The Japanese began to retreat down the slope back into the jungle. Dawn on September 14th revealed the true scale of the slaughter. Over 1,000 Japanese bodies lay on and around the ridge. They were piled 3 and 4 deep in some places where the machine gun fire had been most concentrated. The kunai grass was trampled flat and soaked with blood. The smell of death hung over everything. The Marines had held, barely, by their fingernails, by their refusal to accept defeat. Out of the 840 Raiders and Para-Marines who'd started the battle, only a few hundred were still combat effective. The 1st Parachute Battalion had been gutted. Only 89 paratroopers could walk off the ridge under their own power, but they'd held. Edson walked the battlefield in the morning light, his uniform torn and dirty, his face drawn with exhaustion. He stopped at the positions where his men had fought and died. He looked out toward Henderson Field, still in American hands because of what these men had done. The airfield's Wildcats and Dauntlesses took off throughout the day, hunting the remnants of Kawaguchi's brigade as they fled through the jungle. The Japanese general had promised his superiors a victory. Instead, he'd led his men to destruction. His 35th Infantry Brigade had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. He would eventually be recalled to Rabaul to explain his failure. For the Marines on the ridge, the victory came at a terrible price, but it was victory nonetheless. Henderson Field remained operational. The airstrikes against Japanese shipping and bases continued. The Japanese would try again to retake Guadalcanal, throwing more men and ships into the meat grinder. The battle for Henderson Field in October would be even larger, but they would never come as close to success as they had on the night of September 13, 1942. The ridge would forever after bear Edson's name, Edson's Ridge. Some called it Bloody Ridge. Both names fit. Merritt Edson received the Medal of Honor for his actions during those 2 desperate nights. The citation spoke of his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. It mentioned his courage under fire, his tactical brilliance, his leadership. What it couldn't fully capture was the image of a man walking upright through a storm of steel, refusing to yield, refusing to let his Marines yield, willing the defense to hold through sheer force of personality. The battle became legendary in Marine Corps history. It joined the pantheon of impossible stands, desperate defenses, victories snatched from the jaws of defeat. Instructors at Marine Corps schools would teach it for decades to come. Students would study Edson's tactics, his use of artillery, his counterattacks, his economy of force. But all the tactical analysis in the world couldn't fully explain what happened on that ridge. What happened was that 840 men, outnumbered more than 3-1, low on ammunition, exhausted, facing an enemy that refused to stop attacking, simply refused to break. They refused to surrender. They refused to retreat. They held their ground because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary, because retreat wasn't an option, because behind them was an airfield that had to be held, and in front of them was an enemy that had to be stopped. The Marines who fought on Edson's Ridge carried bolt-action rifles into battle against a modern enemy. They'd been in combat for over a month, living on reduced rations, fighting dysentery and malaria along with the Japanese. They had every reason to break, every justification to fall back to the next defensive line, to preserve their strength, to survive to fight another day. They didn't. The Japanese soldiers who attacked the ridge weren't cowards either. They'd marched through hell to reach the battlefield. They'd attacked again and again into withering fire. They'd climbed over the bodies of their fallen comrades to get at the Americans. Their courage was never in question. But courage alone isn't enough. Combat is about more than bravery. It's about training, leadership, fire discipline, combined arms, logistics, intelligence. It's about 100 different factors all coming together at the critical moment. On September 12th and 13th, 1942, all those factors favored the Marines, not overwhelmingly, not easily, but enough, just barely enough. The Japanese had committed a series of errors that would haunt their entire Guadalcanal campaign. They'd underestimated American strength throughout the battle. They'd divided their forces, feeding them piecemeal into the fight rather than concentrating for one overwhelming blow. They'd relied on night attacks and bayonet charges instead of combined arms tactics. They'd failed to coordinate their naval bombardment, air attacks, and ground assault into a unified operation. Most critically, they'd underestimated the Americans' will to fight. Japanese doctrine held that fighting spirit, the warrior ethos, would triumph over material superiority. Kawaguchi had believed his veteran soldiers, steeped in the Bushido tradition, would overwhelm the soft Americans in close combat. He'd learned otherwise at the cost of his brigade. The Americans, for their part, had their own lessons to learn. The battle had been a near-run thing. If Edson hadn't raided Tasamboko and discovered the Japanese buildup, if he hadn't convinced Vandegrift to let him move to the ridge, if the reserves hadn't arrived when they did, the outcome could have been very different. Close-run battles are won or lost on small margins. In the larger context of the Pacific War, Edson's Ridge was a turning point within a turning point. The Guadalcanal campaign itself was America's first offensive operation, the moment when the tide began to turn from Japanese expansion to American advance. Within that campaign, Edson's Ridge was the critical moment. If Henderson Field had fallen in September, the entire American position on Guadalcanal would have become untenable. The Marines would have been forced to evacuate or face annihilation. The Japanese would have regained control of the Southern Solomons. The entire timetable of the Pacific War would have shifted. Instead, the Marines held. Henderson Field continued operations. The Wildcats and Dauntlesses continued to maul Japanese shipping. The Tokyo Express, the fast destroyer runs that brought Japanese reinforcements down the slot between the Solomon Islands, ran a gauntlet of American air power every time they came. The Japanese lost ships they couldn't replace, planes they couldn't replace, pilots they couldn't replace. The waters around Guadalcanal earned the name Iron Bottom Sound from the number of ships sent to the bottom. The fighting on Guadalcanal would continue for another 4 months after Edson's Ridge. There would be more battles, more bloodshed. The battle for Henderson Field in October would see even more Japanese troops thrown against the American perimeter. The naval battles offshore, the battles of Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, and the climactic naval battle of Guadalcanal in November would see some of the most intense ship-to-ship combat of the entire war. But the Japanese would never again come as close to victory as they had on September 13, 1942. after Edson's Ridge, it was only a matter of time. The Americans grew stronger as supplies and reinforcements arrived. The Japanese grew weaker as their logistics collapsed under the weight of American air and naval attacks. In February 1943, the Japanese evacuated their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. The island was secure. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion was pulled off Guadalcanal in October for rest and refit. They'd earned it. In 2 months of continuous combat, they'd established themselves as one of the elite units in the Pacific. Their battles at Tulagi, Stasimboco, and Edson's Ridge had written their name in Marine Corps legend. The 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, under Colonel Evans Carlson, would have their own moment of glory on Guadalcanal. In November, they would conduct what became known as the Long Patrol, a 30-day guerrilla operation behind Japanese lines that saw them kill hundreds of enemy soldiers while taking minimal casualties themselves. But that's another story. Merritt Edson would go on to command the 5th Marine Regiment during the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign, earning another Navy Cross. After the war, he would advocate for a strong Marine Corps and speak out against what he saw as dangerous cuts to military readiness. In 1955, facing ill health and concerned about his ability to continue contributing, he would take his own life. The Marine Corps named a firing range at Quantico in his honor. It seemed fitting. Edson had always been about accuracy and precision in life as in combat. The men who fought on the ridge scattered to other battles after Guadalcanal. Some went to Tarawa, where the 2nd Marine Division would face a different kind of hell in November 1943. Some went to the Central Pacific, to Kwajalein and Eniwetok and Saipan. Some went to Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Many didn't come home. War is like that. The Marine Raiders, as a separate organization, would be disbanded in 1944, consolidated into the 4th Marine Regiment. The Corps decided it didn't need separate elite units. Every Marine was a rifleman. Every Marine was elite. The Raider ethos, however, lived on. The tactics they'd pioneered, the aggressive patrolling, the raids behind enemy lines, the emphasis on physical fitness and marksmanship became part of Marine Corps doctrine. In 2006, the Marine Corps would resurrect the Raider name, designating the Marine Special Operations Regiment as Marine Raiders. The new Raiders would carry on the tradition established by Edson and Carlson and the men who fought on Guadalcanal. They would deploy to Afghanistan and Iraq, conducting the same kind of raids and special operations their predecessors had conducted against the Japanese. The name meant something. It meant excellence. It meant refusing to quit. Standing on Edson's Ridge today, it's hard to imagine the carnage that unfolded there in 1942. The jungle has reclaimed much of the battlefield. The shell craters have filled in. The blood has long since washed away in tropical rains. There's a memorial now, a simple stone marker noting what happened on this ground. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson commanded some 840 Marines of his 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion who fought here, successfully defending this ridge for 2 consecutive nights, from 12 Sep to 14 Sep 1942. Simple words for an extraordinary event. The marker doesn't capture the sound of the naval bombardment, the screams of dying men, the chattering of machine guns firing until their barrels glowed. It doesn't capture the smell of cordite and blood and fear. It doesn't capture what it felt like to be on that ridge, outnumbered, low on ammunition, with an enemy that kept coming no matter how many you killed. But maybe that's appropriate. Some things can't be captured in words or stone. Some things can only be understood by those who were there, who lived through it, who saw their friends die and kept fighting anyway. The memorial serves its purpose. It reminds visitors that something important happened here, that men fought here, that men died here, that the outcome of the battle mattered. In the end, Edson's Ridge was about more than tactics or firepower or terrain. It was about will, the will to hold when holding seemed impossible, The will to fight when fighting meant almost certain death. The will to refuse surrender, refuse defeat, refuse to accept anything less than victory. The Japanese had come to Guadalcanal expecting the Americans to fold. Throughout the campaign, they'd operated on the assumption that Americans were soft, that they lacked the warrior spirit necessary for the brutal combat of the Pacific. Time and again, they've been proven wrong. At the Tenarú River in August, at Edson's Ridge in September, at Henderson Field in October, at the Matanikau River, in the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, the Americans had fought with a ferocity and determination that shocked the Japanese. Edson's Ridge was where that myth died decisively. 3,000 Japanese soldiers had thrown themselves at 840 Marines with everything they had: fighting spirit, veteran troops, the momentum of 2 years of victory across the Pacific, the confidence of an empire that thought itself invincible. None of it had been enough. The Marines had refused to break. They'd held their ground and slaughtered the attackers with a combination of superior firepower, better tactics, and an absolute refusal to yield. The battle had implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. It sent a message to both sides. To the Americans, it proved they could stand toe-to-toe with the Japanese and win. The myth of Japanese invincibility, born at Pearl Harbor and nurtured through the dark days of early 1942, took another blow. First, Midway had shown the Navy could defeat the Japanese at sea. Now Guadalcanal was showing the Marines could defeat them on land. To the Japanese, Edson's Ridge was a wake-up call they couldn't afford to ignore, but did anyway. The Americans weren't going to collapse. They weren't going to abandon Guadalcanal. They were going to fight for every inch of ground, and they had the resources and determination to keep fighting. Japan's strategy of a quick, decisive victory was failing. The war was turning into a grinding attrition struggle, precisely the kind of war Japan couldn't win. But grand strategy wasn't on the minds of the Marines on Edson's Ridge on September 14, 1942. They were too busy counting their dead, treating their wounded, and trying to choke down their first real meal in 2 days. They were too exhausted to think about the turning points of history. They'd done their job. They'd held the ridge. That was enough. In the decades since, historians have analyzed the battle from every angle. They've studied Edson's tactics, Kawaguchi's mistakes, the terrain, the weapons, the doctrine. They've written books and articles and dissertations. They've created maps and simulations and war games, all valuable, all useful for understanding what happened and why. But understanding a battle intellectually is different from understanding it viscerally. The real story of Edson's Ridge isn't in the tactical diagrams or casualty figures. It's in the moments. The machine gunner who kept firing even after a Japanese grenade had landed in his position, buying his squadmates time to escape. The radio man who stayed at his post, calling in artillery, even as Japanese soldiers overran his fighting hole. The company commander who led a counterattack with his .45 pistol and a combat knife because he'd run out of rifle ammunition. It's in the small decisions that accumulated into victory. Edson choosing to raid Tasimboko, Vandegrift trusting Edson's judgment and letting him move to the ridge, the artillery forward observers who calculated coordinates while under direct fire, the riflemen who made every shot count because they knew ammunition was running low, the men who carried wounded comrades back to safety when they could have saved themselves. War isn't really about grand strategy and geopolitics, even though those things matter. War is about individual human beings making choices under the worst circumstances imaginable. Fight or flee, hold or retreat, live or die. The Marines on Edson's Ridge made their choices. They chose to fight. They chose to hold. Many chose to die rather than abandon their positions. That's what makes the battle worth remembering. Not the tactical lessons, though those are important. Not the strategic implications, though those mattered greatly. What makes it worth remembering is the human element, the courage, the sacrifice, the refusal to quit. Those qualities don't age, they don't become obsolete. They matter just as much today as they did in 1942. The Marine Corps understands this. That's why Edson's Ridge is still taught at Officer Candidate School and the Basic School. That's why drill instructors tell the story to recruits at boot camp. That's why the Marine Raider's name was resurrected. The Corps wants every Marine to know that when the chips are down, when everything looks hopeless, when you're outnumbered and outgunned and out of options, you don't surrender. You don't quit. You find a way to win. It's a high standard to maintain, an exhausting standard. Not everyone can meet it. But that's what makes the Marines different. They set the standard higher than anyone else, and then they hold themselves to it. Edson's Ridge is part of that standard. It's a benchmark. When the situation looks impossible, someone will invoke Edson's Ridge. Red Mike held with 840 against 3,000. We can handle this. The story resonates beyond the Marine Corps, too. There's something universal about it. The underdog story. The last stand. The thin line between civilization and chaos. Humans have been telling variations of this story for thousands of years. Thermopylae, the Alamo, Rorke's Drift. Edson's Ridge joins that list. What separates myth from history is evidence. The difference between a good story and a true story is documentation. Edson's Ridge has both. It's a hell of a story. But it's also absolutely true. The after-action reports exist. The casualty lists exist. The Japanese records exist. The ground itself exists, still bearing the scars if you know where to look. The survivors told their stories, too, in the years after the war. Some wrote memoirs. Some gave interviews. Some just told their grandchildren about the time they fought on a ridge in the Solomon Islands and refused to lose. Each telling added details, perspectives, human moments that the official records couldn't capture. As the years passed and the survivors aged, the story became more important. It became a link to a time when America faced an existential threat and rose to meet it. When ordinary men did extraordinary things, not for glory or recognition, but because it needed doing. When the outcome wasn't certain, when defeat was a real possibility, and they chose to fight anyway. We live in a different world now. The existential threats have changed, but the need for courage hasn't. The need for people who refuse to quit, who hold the line when holding seems impossible, who face overwhelming odds and fight anyway, that need remains. That's why stories like Edson's Ridge matter. They remind us what humans are capable of when pushed to the limit. They remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. They remind us that refusing to surrender, even when surrender seems rational, can change the course of history. On September 12, 1942, 840 Marines dug foxholes on a ridge south of Henderson Field. 2 days later, 840 minus casualties still held that ridge. The Japanese had thrown 3,000 men at them. The Japanese had failed. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The Guadalcanal campaign continued. The Pacific War turned. The world changed. All because some men with bolt-action rifles and machine guns decided that retreating wasn't an option, that surrender wasn't in their vocabulary, that they would hold their ground or die trying. Most of them would have told you they were just doing their job. Marines do that. They downplay the heroism, focus on the mission, deflect the praise to the men who didn't make it home. But doing your job when your job involves standing in the face of 3,000 screaming enemy soldiers, when doing your job means accepting that you'll probably die in the next few hours, when doing your job anyway despite knowing all that, that's not just doing your job. That's heroism. That's courage. That's refusing to surrender when you have every reason to. The ridge is quiet now. The jungle has grown back. Birds sing. The sun rises and sets. The world has moved on. But the ridge remembers. The ground remembers. And as long as there's a Marine Corps, Marines will remember. They'll tell the story of Red Mike Edson and his 840 Raiders and Paramarines. They'll tell it to remind themselves what Marines do when faced with impossible odds. They hold the line. They refuse to surrender. They find a way to win. That's the legacy of Edson's Ridge. Not just a tactical victory, though it was that. Not just a strategic turning point, though it was that too. The legacy is the example. The proof that courage and determination and refusal to quit can overcome terrible odds. The reminder that when everything is on the line, when the outcome hangs in the balance, individual choices matter. Individual acts of courage matter. Individual refusals to surrender matter. On September 12, 1942, the Japanese had the Marines outnumbered. They had momentum. They had confidence. They had everything except the one thing that mattered most. They didn't have men willing to die before giving up an inch of ground. The Marines did. That made all the difference.